Continuing to follow this breaking news story out of the Low Country, the Slager trial. At this point, still lots of questions. Just hearing from the foreman who says that they need a further explanation of the law, hoping that that could bring the jury to a unanimous decision.
Yeah, so for clarification right now, a mistrial has not been declared. The judge said that the jury will be briefed in a room, and further explanation of the law may help the jury out right now. We have Lauren Thomas joining us, who has been following this case in Charleston and here as well from the beginning to now. Lauren, what do we know at this point?
Well, there were 3 important notes that were sent by jurors today, 4 in total, but 3 that I think we should really focus on. And that was one, a letter version from one of the jurors that said, hey, I don't think that I can make a decision in this case, and it can't come up with a guilty verdict, and also said that he feels sorry that this will impact the Scott family, and knowing that the man who killed their son won't be going to jail because of him. But 2 other notes from the jury were that they say it's one juror who is having an issue with a guilty verdict, and they asked that, could he be removed? That was those were the notes that were given from the jury today.
And there were alternate jurors, but explain that a little bit, because they were released from this, right?
Right. So alternate jurors will not be an option in this trial because they were released before deliberations even began. So you can have 11 jurors who feel one way, but that one juror who feels differently is going to cause a deadlock and potentially cause a mistrial, because an Allen charge was brought up in court today. And just for that clarification, it's kind of like a judge putting his foot down and saying, hey guys, if you need to go back into the jury room and come up with a verdict, or else he'll have to declare a mistrial.
So at this point, what we've heard from the foreman is that the jurors are deadlocked. They asked for further clarification. We can't say this enough. Joyce just mentioned it. There has not been a mistrial declared in this trial yet, but the jurors have said that they are deadlocked. Earlier this afternoon, at one point coming out and saying to the judge, there's no way we're going to be able to come to a consensus decision on this trial.
Right. And so that's what they're going back into their jury room now to talk about, to try to get more clarification on the law, and then hopefully come up with a decision there, whether to move forward with a deadlock decision or with a verdict.
I know earlier today we did the math on how long they've been deliberating. It's been more than 14 hours.
Right, almost 17 now.
Okay.
So they've been back there working. So they've taken their time on this. We'll see what happens as the outcome.
I wanted to ask you, Scarlett Wilson has asked Judge Newman to provide jury definitions for both passion and fear. Can you explain why she would be asking that at this point?
Well, part of the jury charge was that you have to know if it's voluntary manslaughter or murder. Part of that voluntary manslaughter charge was their passion involved, because with murder, with a murder charge, there has to be malice involved, which means hostility, ill will towards someone. But with manslaughter, there could be a spur of the moment, heat of the moment, a kind of event, which includes passion, and then that could be a voluntary manslaughter charge there.
It's been the defense's plight to convince the jurors that Michael Slager was in fear for his life.
Right.
For anyone who is just now tuning into the story, talk us a little bit through their definition of in fear of his life, and how maybe that is the one point that has that one juror saying, I can't make a decision.
Well, throughout this whole case, Michael Slager has said that he did this out of self-defense, and said that Walter Scott was coming at him with a taser, and that's why he shot him. Now, in the video, you clearly see that Walter Scott is running away when the first shot is fired, but that heat of the moment kind of idea comes up with self-defense, and you have to work it out that way. And so the defense has argued multiple times that this is that Michael Slager feared for his life, and that he acted within the realm of use of force as a police officer. The state, of course, saying that he did too much.
All right. And I did want to ask, they did bring up throughout the process of the trial, they did bring up witnesses and experts. Can you talk a little bit about any law enforcement experts that were there giving their opinions on whether or not Michael Slager should have pulled the trigger?
4 experts, or 4 members of law enforcement at the North Charleston Police Department spoke on the last day of testimony and said that they would have shot at a suspect who was running away and was potentially a threat. That they would have used lethal force. And so that goes back to their training. They're trained to use lethal force if they need to. And so it's all about them making that decision. Now, that's up to the jurors to listen to those testimonies and come up with a decision on if that was justifiable in this case. But members of law enforcement have said on the stand that they would have pulled the trigger as well. Conceivably,
There are 4 things that could happen out of this. 1, there could be a mistrial. 2, he could be found guilty of murder or manslaughter. And then 4, he could be found innocent. There's a difference in the prison time that is allotted for a person who's convicted of murder and one of manslaughter. What's that timing like?
Well, for murder is a minimum of 30 years to life in prison, and for manslaughter it's a minimum of 2 years to 30 years in prison. So you have a difference there, a great difference from 2 years in prison to 30 years.
You've been following this trial since the very beginning. Talk to us about how that manslaughter charge ended up on the table.
Well, as I said, there's a question of whether malice was involved in this case, because malice is incorporated in the murder charge, but it's not in the voluntary manslaughter charge. So the state had to prove malice, but if they couldn't prove malice, they wanted to make sure that there was also another charge on the table of voluntary manslaughter, so that jurors had another option if they didn't believe that the court proved malice.
Okay. I'm reading a tweet from our reporter Chuck Ringwald, who's in Charleston right now. He says that court has recessed for a, quote, unusual situation. That's what Judge Newman said. And he's tweeting again the makeup of that jury. 6 white men, 5 white women, and 1 black man is on that jury.
Right.
All right.
One other question while we're, again, waiting in this recess to hear what happens with this decision. You've been following it because you've been watching online. Chuck is actually in the courtroom. Talk to us about the behind the scenes that our viewers are not getting, because we're only giving them snippets at 5, 6, 7, and 11.
Right.
Talk to us about what you're seeing as a reporter following this very closely.
Well, one thing that's interesting, and I've been talking to Chuck about this too, the families have been in the courtroom since day one. Michael Slager's family on one side, Walter Scott's family on the other side. They've been quiet, they've been attentive, they've been at some points emotional, but if they are emotional, they leave the courtroom because they don't want anything to jeopardize the jurors taking in that information from that testimony on the stand. And so that was interesting to see from a courtroom perspective, and I think that people need to understand that both families will be impacted by this verdict.
All right, Lauren, thank you so much for your expertise in following this trial. We also have another trial that we've been following in Charleston.